Okay, we've had a bit of a change in panelists. Unfortunately, Andrea Cook from WFP was ill today. So in her place, I'd like to welcome Pablo Fajnzylber, Manager of the Economic Management and Country Programs Unit at the World Bank, and Oscar Garcia, Director of the Independent Office of Evaluation at IFAD, and Masahiro Igarashi, Director of the Office of Evaluation at FAO. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to just start with a personal question for you, Pablo. What have you taken away from the last 2 days, and how are you thinking of applying it or shaping it to the work that you do?
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much to IFAD for inviting us. I'm with the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank, so we are sort of sister organizations with you at IFAD. I should say that our team has recently done an evaluation on something that is very similar to the topic of this conference. As you may know, the World Bank has two goals. One is very aligned with the SDG 1, which is to eradicate extreme poverty. But starting in 2013, the World Bank incorporated a second goal, which is to promote shared prosperity. That is not exactly to reduce inequality, but it has a lot of things in common with it. And last year, in 2017, we completed an evaluation of how well the World Bank is doing in terms of putting into practice this goal. So many of the things that I heard and that I learned these 2 days are consistent and reminded me of some of our own conclusions. But then there were others that were new. So the way I will put it is, first of all, and I'm going to be quoting some of the colleagues that have been speaking for the past 2 days, is, as I believe Dr. Chitra was saying earlier today, if one wants to reach the poorest of the poor, one has to have a strategy. One cannot just trust a trickle-down sort of approach. So the way we put that in sort of more technical terms, and considering that we're talking about evaluation lessons, right, is that when we evaluate our agencies' projects and strategies, we have learned that we need to look for not only a nominal expression of being motivated by trying to reach, let's say, a reduction in inequality or a reduction in the poverty among the extremely poor, but one has to look at whether those projects and those strategies actually have what people call a theory of change, whether there is a logic that by which the activities that are going to be implemented will lead to some results, some outputs that will in turn lead to other outputs and outcomes, and that will eventually translate into improved living conditions for, in this case, the extreme rural poor. So first implication is don't trust just nominal expressions of desire to implement a project or a strategy that will supposedly reduce inequality. Actually look for a concrete plan, a concrete theory of change. Coincidentally, next week we are giving a workshop for our executive board, because they really became really interested in this idea. They said, okay, well, that makes sense. How do we check that the projects that come to us do have that theory of change? So to me, that is something that was confirmed. The second thing is the importance of context specificity. The fact that, I mean, this was said in many different ways during different sessions. I remember somebody saying it shouldn't be the method driving the question, rather the question driving the method. There was the idea that, again, the poorest of the poor, those excluded, oftentimes indigenous groups, disabled, women, youth, the old in different countries, understanding the cultural sensitivities that will play a role on their uptake of programs. So somebody was saying, if you want to reach certain populations, you want to target value chains in which they are more likely to be part of. And so, on the one hand, to facilitate uptake. On the other hand, avoid cookie cutter approaches and understand, somebody was saying, it's about making sure that markets and policies work for the poor. And oftentimes what you see is biases in taxing, biases in spending, biases in regulations, biases in the way markets work. So understanding what those biases are allow you to design interventions that will have a chance of trying to address those biases. So I would say to increase uptake and to increase impact. Third thing that is again a little bit technical is that the world, I think, has always been complex, but it's becoming even more complex and very interconnected and very fast changing. So it would be naive to think that our projects will not interact with many other factors. So when you understand that, when you recognize this complexity, you need to move from very basic project-based evaluation methods to methods that take into account this complexity. And that in practice means multi-level, multi-method, multi-site evaluations. Because there is a trade-off. When you want to really establish causality, you need to go to the intervention, a very basic intervention level. But the very basic intervention level will not do the trick. We've learned these past 2 days that there are, on the one hand, you need smart social policies. On the other hand, you need pro-poor growth. And each of those is composed of many other components. So when you're looking at, are we achieving the reduction in inequality that we're looking for, we will have to take into account a mix of many interventions, plus the many other interventions by many other actors. So in order to do that, you will likely be unable to establish an attribution of causality to your intervention. If you want to do that, you will have to be a little bit more humble, and that is the third conclusion. The fourth conclusion is that also because of this complexity and because of this ever-changing context, course corrections are inevitable if you really want to achieve the goals that you're setting out to achieve. And this was also said earlier today. When you start an 8-year project, it would be naive to think that the way you design it, even if you design it very well, that design will still apply several years later, particularly in countries that are changing. So encouraging course corrections is something that is also, to some extent, the job, is something that the evaluation part of agencies can help with. And I think the self-evaluation, in particular, should encourage candor in, for example, implementation reports. People have the incentive to say that things are all well, right? Because when things really become bad, they hope they will be somewhere else, right? But people should be encouraged to be candid about when projects are not achieving their objectives, and people who restructure projects, even if several times, they should be rewarded, not penalized. So course corrections are key. And finally, something that the last panel was just discussing extensively, the importance of partnerships. Again, in this very complex and interconnected world, if we want to have some impact, we need to work with others. And there was the humanitarian with development important partnership. When you look at forced displacement by conflict, by just poverty, by climate shocks, those people are oftentimes forcefully displaced for generations, not just for a year or two. So there's a point in which it becomes so protracted that if you want to really help those people, you need to combine with development assistance. So humanitarian development, private sector and public sector, civil society organizations and producer organizations, I think is something that came up very strongly. So those will be some initial thoughts.
Thank you for that
Thank
very thoughtful feedback, and also for proving that you actually paid attention over the last 2 days. So that's very good. Oscar, what about you? What are the things you have taken away from the last 2 days that you will use to shape the work that you do and what your team does?
Yes, thank you very much, Joanne. There was a purpose in putting this last session with a group of evaluators, because we have recognized that there are changes in the context that we need to acknowledge and address very head-on. And those are related to the Sustainable Development Agenda. I think our challenges are not the same as they were before. The Sustainable Development Agenda has brought in the complexity that Pablo was referring to the forefront of the development, integrating really the economic dimension, the social dimension, the environmental dimension, and the political dimension as well. Therefore, as evaluators, we cannot rest at ease just with our old instruments and approaches. That is why we have seen that the influence of information and communication technology is changing the way we conduct, or we should conduct, evaluations of development programs. And by the same token, one of the biggest challenges of our age is indeed this of increased growth but increased disparities. And therefore, addressing inequalities is a complex undertaking. What are then the implications for evaluation of this complexity? That we need to revitalize our analytical tools. And for revitalizing our analytical tools, we have a first approach, which is there is no one evaluation method or approach that is the paramount answer to our challenges. We need a mixed method approach. But among evaluators, the use of mixed method approach is not something new, but it's sometimes an easy way out to say that we will continue doing the same things. And I think we need to address that challenge seriously, and starting with more difficult questions. And the more difficult questions are not just what are the results of this development intervention, have we achieved the results, yes or no, not just the effectiveness dimension. Because, as we said, there are other dimensions of our development agenda that need to refine our analytical tools. For that, secondly, we need to come up with analytical frameworks that understand that complexity. That could be expressed in a I would say, evolution from the log frame approach, which is more based on a linear way of thinking, to a multi-layered, multi-party, but also multi-factors approach that could be embedded in a theory of change. Theory of change have now really helped the evaluation community to try to understand better the causalities and the different contributions that can be done. But if I use an analogy from the physics, we now are analyzing force fields. And as you know, force fields do not have just a linear answer. There are vectors in a force field. And understanding the trajectories of these vectors is as important as understanding where do they come from. And that is where the power dimension comes into it. And we cannot address inequalities without addressing these power relations. That is why the third implication for this debate on inequality for evaluation, I think, is the recognition of the importance of political economy analysis. Political economy in the terms of really understanding who wins and who loses by the effects of certain development interventions. We know that our development projects and programs have very good intentions. But they also do have unintended consequences. And among those unintended consequences, there might be this contribution or not to increasing disparities. As we have seen, development is not neutral, and that non-neutrality of development forces us as evaluators to better understand the dynamics that are lying behind any development intervention. This is not an easy challenge. We don't have a single answer to that. But I think the debate over the last two days has been very helpful in addressing the different facets of this reality. And in a multidisciplinary approach, we have expanded our knowledge about that. But in my view, these three lessons from the debate could be applied to our evaluation thinking. The need to use more mixed methods approach, the need to refine our analytical frameworks by developing further theories of change that take account the interplay of different dimensions of development, and the need to incorporate a political economy lens into the realities that we are witnessing as evaluators. I will stop there.
Thank you so much. And I think what you've also brought in there is the importance of evaluation. The importance of evaluation and evaluators in achieving these goals. Now, Masa, I'm going to come to you with the same question. I see we're getting a lot of questions on Menti, which we come to in a moment. What are you taking away from what you've heard over the last 2 days, and how is this going to influence the way you at FAO will be approaching your work?
Okay, thank you. And also I thank IFAD, the Evaluation Office, for organizing this, because I think it's opportune. Why I think it's opportune? I think this is the next, do you hear me? Yeah? Frontier for the evaluation. Inequalities that existed throughout the human history, right? You talk about the kings and peasants or whatever have you. But today, the awareness, because of the information technology partly, about the social injustice and inequalities and disparities are put under the broad light of the public. So there is this consciousness about how we're going to address it. And I was thinking about this for some time, and this conference come very opportune. However, I wanted to be a bit more provocative about this, because when I heard about this conference, I thought, so what is the difference between the poverty reduction and reducing inequalities, right? What do you mean by inequalities? Because to evaluate, you have to know the benchmarks and what are you evaluating about. Poverty reduction and reducing inequalities overlaps but not the same. Right? And when I came here, I saw that we are not talking about the same thing. Some people are talking about the poverty reduction, some people are talking about injustice, power relationships, and so on. So I was thinking for 2 days about that, and then listening to different presentations. Some people talk about inequality in a macro sense, like in a trade or urban versus rural, or maybe agriculture versus industry, and so on. Some people are talking about more micro issues, such as individual power relationships, as small as maybe in the household inequalities, or talking about the land, or talking about ethnics and then indigenous people and so on. So there is a micro, macro, different types of inequalities. Are we talking about income, or are we talking about more quality of life, or are we talking about the power? Right? So these are different things. When we talk about absolute poverty, we may prescribe something like a social protection policies or maybe employment generation. If we talk about absolute misery, maybe we have different prescription for that. But we have been tackling poverty reduction for a long time. It has been the agenda for the World Bank or UN agencies for a long time. So what's new about talking about inequalities if it's not about the poverty reduction? Are we talking about the relative poverty as opposed to absolute poverty? So for the poor people, who cares what rich people does? What they get. So maybe, as presented in yesterday's keynote speech, we are talking about injustice, unfairness, inequity. So is that what we are going to look at in evaluations? I think we need to discuss a bit more and deciding if we are going to evaluate inequalities, what we are talking about. Right? Income, personal level, macro level, sector level, right? Influence of the global economy on macroeconomic structure of the country, or are we talking about policy incidents, or are we talking about legal incidents in terms of the rights of this or that? So we need a little bit more clarity on that. So this is something that I can answer here, but I think we need to continue the conversation so that we have certain consensus on why poverty reduction is not necessarily the same thing as reducing inequalities.
Well, let me actually ask you a question that's come up over here. The question is, how do we concretely evaluate power relations? Maybe I can also ask you, is that something that we should be evaluating? And if so, how do we do it?
Well, for instance, in terms of gender inequality or inequity issue that we have been looking at quite closely right now, there were some group of thoughts or the theories about how to analyze the empowerment of women, for instance. And then we can look at how this can be measured, how we can collect the data that can give us some direction into how we can intervene into that inequality situation. If we are talking about social power relationships, I think we heard a lot about how to implement the rights, but it is also context-based, political economy discussion. There's no one answer, but for the particular power relation issues that we are talking about, I think we have to think about. We have landless and landowners, that are power relationships. Also, when we often do the projects, we do the selection and targeting. And at the field level, what we evaluators found was often the project implementers give it to the powerful. You know, UN loves all these community organizations and the power to the people, but actually what happens often is that we go to the communities and get the locals decide, but the locals have a politics. They have power politics within themselves. And so those who are close to the UN agencies will get the power, and then get the power of distributing whatever is given to the community. So there's a lot of things to think about. And going closer to the field, I think we have to be more careful about this power analysis.
Thank you. Pablo, I'm going to talk to you about the mid-course corrections question, because you mentioned that in your response earlier. So how effective are they, and should evaluators be involved in a midterm analysis of the course corrections?
Right. Yes, I saw the question in the screen. Let me start with the second part. Personally, as you all know, there is the external independent evaluation and there is the internal self-evaluation. My sense is that the midterm evaluations are a self-evaluation tool. If the external evaluator were to be involved, it will in a way create a conflict of interest for the time when he evaluates the final outcome of the intervention. Because if you influenced the course corrections, then you become party and judge at the same time. So on the second question, I don't think the external evaluators should be involved, but the external evaluators can, in a way, encourage it, because when they look at the final results of interventions, and we do it, in fact, we look at the extent to which the project was adapted to changes in the external conditions. Now, why is it that it doesn't really work on the self-evaluation side, in my own personal limited experience? It's because of the lack of candor. Nobody likes to report that things are not going well. right? Now, that culture is changing because I think management of development agencies are trying to pass on the message that you will not be penalized. You can actually be rewarded for being candid, but it's the lack of candor.
Great, thank you. Now, data and the importance of having data has come up many times over the last 2 days, and there are a few questions on here relating to having data and baselines. So, Oscar, I'm going to ask you how they keep moving, so now I'm kind of lost them, but if my memory serves me right, there was a question about the lack of baselines, and should governing bodies approve projects where there isn't a baseline in place? And I think there was also one on how to evaluate projects that did not have a existing baseline.
Well, I would say that that's our daily way of conducting evaluations. I mean, very few projects have very solid baselines at the outset. That's the ideal situation, but it's not really what is happening. And nevertheless, evaluators come at the end of an intervention and establish the potential counterfactual to the effects to understand really what has been the contribution of this intervention to the achievement of the development objectives of such a project or a program. Therefore, that is not new to evaluators. But as we have seen, one of the implications of addressing the inequalities issues is the need for more disaggregate data. And there is a revolution taking place right now that is allowing overall international community to get access to more information that we did before. The problems with that information is that it's still, I would say, an explosion of information sources that is not necessarily harmonized for the use of in a more focused way. However, that proliferation of information sources is healthy, in my view, and it's a matter of just shifting the focus towards how this disaggregated data can help us understand the phenomenon at local level. One of the shifts that we have seen as part of the debate over these two days is the importance of the territorial approach. More than just national territories and more local governance dimensions are very important. And there, I think, there is the ability then to have better information for the design of the projects. And that is another aspect that I would like to echo and resonate with what Osvaldo Feinstein was sharing with us later today when he said we can influence the design of projects so that we can address better the differentiated needs of groups of vulnerable target population. That differentiated approach needs some information. That information can be collected at the project level and therefore can be embedded into the design of interventions that could be later evaluated. We have a long way to go, but I would say that is kind of an initial step. And as an illustration, I would like to reiterate what Masa said on gender equality. When IFAD started evaluating gender equality in 2009 for all its projects, at the beginning there was a pushback saying, but this intervention is not aimed at reducing gender disparities. However, we said, how is it possible that a development intervention in the rural area is not addressing gender equality? And by now, after all these years, our analysis is now more refined, and we just don't count women. That was at the beginning. Now we see if women are having transformative practices that are related to the way, for instance, they use their time. And the use of time in productive activities in the rural area determines a lot about the power relations in that community and that society. And when that gets equalized by project design that allows that time of the women being spent and recognized productively and more equally to men, we see a transformative change. Therefore, I really like the example that Masa brought to the table, because it shows us how it is possible to incorporate these type of dimensions in the new development agenda.
Thank you. And also reiterates the point of how evaluations can also influence the way projects are designed and the outcomes. I'd like to just open it up to the floor to see, I see you've got a lot of questions scrolling here, but Faye has a question over there. And anyone else who also wants to a question, or if you want to share any of the things you've taken away over the last 2 days.
Really enjoying the discussions that's been happening at the front panel. My question was around the bit around theory of change. So we've just undertaken a huge review of our theory of change and logic framework, and one of the things that came up to me was, how do we build, besides the theory of change and the evaluation questions, the learning questions? What are the things we need to learn for the adaptive management that you talked about, the course correct, as you call it, we call it adaptive management? What are the things we need to learn as a result of this? And that leads then to the adaptive management. Then what are the capabilities that the teams on the ground and implementers who are working this needs to have in order to be able to reflect on data and the learning questions that then drives the planning and the planning action and reflection process. So those are some of the things that maybe to think about besides the evaluation questions, or what are the learning questions and what are the capabilities that is needed on the ground to then respond to it for adaptive management. The second piece was around gender and the talk about, you know, the risk of just mainstreaming gender across all of your evaluation questions has another risk as well. That is, we are missing some big innovation and things that we should be looking at in how we actually drive real systemic change rather than mainstreaming. So there's always a pro and cons to probably different approaches to think about. So not a question, but more of just some thoughts to share.
Thank you. Are there any others out here? Okay, while you're all thinking of something to say, maybe Pablo, you want to address the question around theory of change and the learnings?
Sure. The challenge of evaluation, right, is that it has always two objectives: learning and accountability. And in order to really succeed on the accountability front, you really need to be credible and independent. Now, you become, in a way, the police, right? And inevitably, people self-rate themselves in a more benign way than others rate. I mean, you always think of yourself, people always tend to think of themselves better than what the rest of the world who has a more independent view has. So in this accountability function, you sort of run the risk of developing a relationship with those whom you are evaluating that may be seen as antagonistic. And that may get in the way of the learning, right? Because you wouldn't open all your books to those who are going to make you accountable on whether you are having your books according to the rules. So it's this fine line that you need to draw between being the source of the data that will be used for accountability purpose, and at the same time having a good engagement with those who are really implementing the project. So I don't know if that helps. In terms of the capability, and the learning questions are what is working, what is not working. Something that came up in the first session or the second was we need to learn from failures, not only successes. So under what context, right? So somebody was just saying in the previous session, it's about what, under certain conditions, which interventions lead to what results. So those are the things that you're always looking for. And in terms of the capabilities, it is an important agenda. I was going to say on the way forward, something that is required is building these capabilities. As I was saying, it's the capabilities of the staff who implement the projects, of the people who actually are beneficiaries of the projects or implement them in the field, of our executive boards. We all need to be on the same page on what this business of theories of change are. And you know, as Masa was saying, if you were to run a survey among your staff, I don't know how many people you are in IFAD, but at the World Bank we're in the 14,000 range, and we were really disappointed that a large percentage of our staff, and our evaluation is on the web, by the way, it's Share Prosperity. A large percentage didn't know what this goal, this corporate goal was, right? So, so there's a lot in terms of building capabilities to run this agenda.
Great, thanks. We've got a question here in the middle. While the messenger's going, if you just give a minute for Oscar to answer the second part of the question, or maybe it was a comment. Is there a risk at missing innovations when you in evaluations if you are very focused on some of the mainstreaming themes like gender?
I don't think so, because in IFAD we do have innovation as a standalone criteria, and gender equality as another standalone criteria, and we have developed quite a comprehensive framework for assessing our projects. But going back to the theory of change, which if I may very briefly refer to, now in IFAD we are engaging management in helping us develop the new the theory of change of that intervention, even if in retrospective. And that exercise has proved very powerful because we try to understand not just the rationale or the logic of the stated objectives, but how to get there. And the sequence of interventions of different components of a project is that sequence is as important as the end result. And therefore, working together before an evaluation starts with management in identifying the theory of change and then collecting the data and undertaking the analysis has a more robust approach to the buy-in of the findings and recommendations that is emerging from that analytical work.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question in the middle.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to one of the points that Oscar made about the analytical framework, because it's not only important to understand what works and what doesn't work, but why. And the why is also allowing you to be candid, because sometimes there are factors that you understand, there are risks and complexities that are playing around, but if we do not think about all that complexity to begin with, then we will try to put as many things under the carpet as possible. So I think that understanding and learning why is too critical, and sometimes we just want to show that things work, but it looks like a magic black box. And I think that, to me, is something that I would like to learn from you guys.
Great. Do we have another question on this one, please?
I wonder also if we should not be looking at trends, because we are evaluating a situation. But this situation things have been changing in the last decades. And I think if we start looking at inequalities, why they have arisen, maybe they've been corrected, whatever it is, we may have a better understanding of what past interventions in that area have generated and learn from that too. So I just think we need to have that comprehensive approach. I love your reference to territorial, but it would be good also to have a timeline. Thank you.
Okay, so trends, analytical framework. I'll also want to bring in what someone was asking on the board here about having guiding principles that are shared in common. So of all those things, Mas, is there something you'd like to comment on? Either one of those comments that came from the audience, or maybe the question about whether we need some guiding principles that we have in common.
Thank you. A little bit about the theory of change and this targeting and these issues. Actually, I think when we talk about things like inequalities or injustice or whatever we define it, we have to have a bit more system thinking. You see, if we focus on our project, and okay, the project is intended to do this, we did that, whether it has been achieved or not, then we miss a lot of things. We know that the intervention is having certain target population, so we want to help them. But what happens to the others, right? I'm an economist in training, so you always have a winners and losers. You have a model firm to help some young entrepreneurs in the country, and we found that the neighboring farmers are losing because their product is not selling well in the market because the new farmers are producing the same product at a better price and so on. There are always competition, price competition, resource competition. Right? So, and also we talk about the power relationship. We intervene, give some power to some people, meaning that we are changing certain structure. So when we look at some projects and interventions, we have to look beyond that project and so on. So theory of change, yes, but we shouldn't be fixated with the theory of change of a intervention, but look at the macro situation, the social, economic, and political structure, and how our interventions or the policies that we support altered that situation, and what is the long-term implication for that. So in that sense, I would think that evaluators, not just saying that, okay, look, equality should be a criteria, but also have some different methodologies to look at and different scope of evaluations if we talk about inequalities and disparities.
Great. Oscar, do you have any comments on the two comments from the audience? And also, if there's anything you want to say about having a common set of guiding principles?
Yes, let me start by the principles. And I think the one of the most important to me would be the utility. Right? I mean, evaluations need to be useful. And if that principle applies, I think that should trump over other type of considerations when enhancing our analytical frameworks. And therefore, I am a bit hesitant about the inclusion of equality as an evaluation criterion, because as much as I recognize the importance of inequality in addressing inequalities, for me, at this stage of the debate, it's a bit difficult to identify the metrics for operationalizing that principle and saying, okay, then what is a highly satisfactory performance in terms of equality or not? And so that is something that perhaps requires some further thinking. And that further thinking should be guided by the principle of utility and how useful it is for that particular intervention or dimension. But in any case, I think this is a very helpful reflection. Let me go back to the comment on trends, fully on board, and certainly would need to look at that. And most of the evaluations done in IFAD cover a period of about 10 years, and therefore we are able to see really the trajectory. And many of the interventions are in the second phase, therefore we could have a larger period of time to assess really the impact of that intervention. But going back to the learning questions, for the learning questions, I would like to link it to our methodological approaches. I think we need to revisit our approach to case studies. Case studies have been done lately very lightly. There is much more explanatory power in case studies that, in my view, is still insufficiently exploited. But that perhaps is a matter for another debate.
Okay, well, let me just pick up on Oscar's point that perhaps we shouldn't be measuring inequality. Pablo, you said that the World Bank is now looking at promoting shared prosperity, but is inequality something that you would look at evaluating and measuring?
Thank you, Joan. And the way I see the issue of where will inequality be in the context of evaluation, first let me say, I think each agency has a very explicit mandate. Today we were read, in a way, I don't know if that was exactly the mandate, but how the debate of inequality came to be so important at IFAD. And the way I understand it, by the way, Masa, which I've learned these past 2 days, but please correct me if I'm wrong, right, is that IFAD has always aimed to reduce rural poverty. But the ongoing debate, and we heard that debate is also ongoing on FAO, is whether the focus should be in those rural poor who are productively integrated in the economy, or whether maybe too much emphasis has been placed in those groups and there should be an increased emphasis on the poorest of the poor regardless of whether they are productively integrated. And as one colleague from FAO mentioned today, maybe it's a false debate because most of them are somehow productively integrated. But the question is and that's where I think the inequality, please correct me if I'm wrong, question came up at IFAD. Because if you are benefiting the rural poor, but you are not benefiting the rural poorest of the poor, which, by the way, is a reality in even some of the most successful rural poverty reduction experiences. And I will mention Ethiopia, I will mention China was mentioned, right? So are we increasing inequality? So by raising the alarm, pay attention to inequality, it's another way of saying pay attention to the poorest of the poor, right? So back to your question, I think the organization has a mandate, right? One should be clear about it. Now, the projects and the programs and the strategies, they have also their own objectives, but they are at a lower level than those corporate objectives. So normally, I think in evaluation, what we and there is a question about project-based evaluation, most evaluation is objective-based, right? So we look at a program, we look at what was the objective, we look at whether it was achieved. And for that, we want a theory of change between the activities that are financed and the objectives, the outcomes. Now, the question is whether we need to go another step further and say, well, even if the project is successful, will that lead to other outcomes that eventually will translate into achieving or making progress towards the corporate objective, right, of, let's say, shared prosperity and poverty reduction in the World Bank, or rural poverty reduction, including the poorest of the poor in the case of IFAD. So my sense is the work that there's a lot of things that need to be improved in evaluation, but the one that is at hand is how do we ensure that even if our projects are successful, they will actually help us achieve our higher level objectives. And that is the types of theories of change that we've been emphasizing lately. I don't know if that answers, but at least I try.
I think it gets somewhere to answering. I think it's a very difficult question, so a difficult one to answer. And I think in doing that, you've answered quite a lot of the things that have come up. Did you? No. Okay. Was there another question here? Another two. Okay, great.
So, João Pedro from the World Bank. I have a comment on this issue on objectives and inequality. Because the way I see it, and we had this discussion in the bank as well in the context of the human opportunity work that we've done, it's any government has multiple objectives, right? And all of them operate with budget constraints. So the issue on equity or addressing inequalities, I think ultimately needs to be put in the context of the cost. And what is the competing cost of doing the last mile across the multiple objectives that any government faces, right? Because clearly there will be certain objectives that will be cheaper to achieve the last mile than others. So given that you're operating on a budget constraint, where do you start? Do you start from the most expensive thing or you start from the cheapest thing? So all this discussion on equity, I think, needs to be put in the context of cost. And it needs to be framed around a cost-benefit analysis. Otherwise, we might have recommendations that might be fiscally very hard to sustain.
Thank you. We have another one over here, and suddenly a whole host of questions. So there's another one.
Yes, so Masahiro started his talk by saying he wanted to be provocative. So maybe we could also end it with something more provocative. What I want to hear from Pablo, Oscar, and Masahiro is, there are many ideas we've thrown around these past 2 days, and I've heard a lot of really exciting things. What I want to know is one or two things you will take back to your organization, concrete things, that will help you sort of do a better job, on evaluation around rural inequalities. Like concrete things, so that when we reconvene this conference in a year or two, we can reconvene this panel and ask you, how did that go? In the spirit of candor and accountability, I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on those things.
So, call to evaluate your commitments in a few years' time. We had a question, another one in the middle, yes.
Well, this is more a reaction to one of the comments. I think I really appreciate the idea of putting things into cost-benefit analysis, but then the pricing of things is critical. So then we have to be careful, and that's what I said, that the analytical framework is critical to see when we put things into the balance, we are having the right price so that we can measure this with the monetary cost of the alternative intervention.
Thank you. And we have another one at the back there. This will be the last round, so if anyone wants to have a final say at this conference, now is your chance. Okay, last one over there.
I wanted to make a couple of comments on what was said. First, I think that Jose is right in pointing out that we don't need just to notice what worked and what didn't, but also ask why. But there's a third element which is crucial, and in which context? Because otherwise we will incur in unwarranted generalizations. Second, with respect to equality, of course, as Oscar mentioned, there's a need for a metric, to develop metrics. But Samantha gave an interesting insight on how to proceed in terms of the tyranny of average. And this has implications both for design and for evaluation. To use indicators, some of the indicators that are already being used, but to look at not only the average results, the average treatment effect, but also the different effects along different groups of interest. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And we have a last question or comment over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. My name is Nee. I'm from the Permanent Representation of Ghana. I just want to throw some thoughts on two issues. One was, I don't know what was your question about the possibility of missing out on innovations. And I think Oscar answered it by saying that at IFAD, it doesn't normally happen. But the truth of the matter is, if you do not make an effort to capture what could be what you would call innovation, then you would really miss out. Because truthfully, you would always have a set of indicators that you would follow. But you make room for new things that are coming up, which you will call innovations. And therefore, it's important that we track what we are really monitoring, so that the new things that come out that we didn't anticipate, we would probably put them in the category of the innovations. The other one was on measuring inequalities and the challenges that we face. Again, we may not be able to go out there and say, this is how we will measure we'll put out a question that answers the question on inequalities, but we must have a set of, I think, indicators which, when put together and during the interpretation, will give us an indication of how inequalities play out. I think it is important that we look at it from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take another last one over here. Thank you.
Hear me now? Oh, there we go. All right. So just a final reflection on the point that was raised there and some of the panel discussion. So, this question about costing is really critical. And one of the points that I raised earlier, what I tried to get across is that, this economic efficiency argument, it's not that donors don't want to or governments don't want to help the poorest of the poor. Sometimes, though, when you're dealing with these budget constraints, you're trying to say, well, what's the most amount of good that I can do within what I have to work with? And that often means that you're going to the places that have better infrastructure, they're easier to access, there's more people, you can get economies of scale. I think the challenge with that, though, is the unintended consequences. If you keep doing that over time, then effectively you're underserving these groups. And that leads me to my second and last point, which is just this question about what are your objectives and where do you situate addressing inequality within those. I think it would be remiss not to include inequality as one of the things you're measuring and one of the objectives you explicitly state. But I also think it would be dangerous to only focus on inequality in isolation from some of those other real objectives that you have too. So, I think the challenge for people that are in management positions is to have good data points on what are all of the trade-offs across all of the objectives and make the best possible choice that they can. So.
Thank you so much. Let's have a last word from each of you, and maybe you can respond to some of the things that were raised here, and sort of looking at the cost effectiveness and whether that should be a guiding principle. The representative from Ghana talking about the importance of having some indicators that might give you an indication of some of the issues around inequality, and then the challenge to say one concrete thing that you're going to do moving forward, and anything else that I might have missed.
I think you're looking at me,
I
right?
am looking at you. Thanks, Pablo.
Thank you, Joanne. So let me start with the last point, because I think it's a very important one that we didn't really touch upon. I think I really liked the work that Samantha, I believe, presented on mapping the beneficiaries of aid, basically. And then we did something very similar in this shared prosperity evaluation that I mentioned, and then comparing that with the mapping of the poor, right? And seeing whether those two, territorial or geographical distributions are congruent. They don't have to be perfectly congruent because, as in another session was discussed, sometimes people who are in the very remote areas, it's so costly to get to them that it's better for them to get to where the services are through migration. I don't want to get into that debate, but I just want to say there are trade-offs, there are cost trade-offs, but at least we should be looking at whether we are concentrating aid resources on the poor, on the richest part of the poor countries, and whether, because not doing that is really not improving opportunities, is just giving more to those that have relatively already more. So I think this is one of the things that I would like to see us doing more. It's taking advantage of new technologies and being able to say where are the beneficiaries of the projects, how does that compare with the distribution of the poor. And I think the work that you do is very useful for that, and I'm sure others do in different agencies similar work. So if I were to focus on one thing, I would focus on this idea of having an explicit theory of change, having a plan. It's very easy to say, we will, with this, let me give you an example. We will invest in rural roads, and this will reduce poverty among the poorest. It's very easy to say that, but if you think through what will be the intermediate steps for that road to lead to that outcome, you will realize that there are many other factors that will have to come and become, reality, and that if you don't have that as part of your territorial development strategy, that road will not lead to that outcome. So creating incentives so that the people who design projects think through all the intermediary steps between not only constructing the road, but then going to the higher level, which is achieving this reduction in poverty among the extreme poor or reducing inequality. I think, to me, if we make progress on that, that would be useful. But I think there are many other things that, by the way, the different agencies that are here represented could work on together. The distributional analysis, for example, I think the idea, the data collection, there's a lot of innovative data collection going on in different agencies, and that could be better shared. Higher frequency data in Mogadishu or in different parts of South Sudan because conditions are changing very rapidly, the usual household survey is not feasible and is not useful. So we do a lot of innovative things in different parts of these agencies that could be better shared, and also continue to share evidence on what works and why under different contexts. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. So we can already start with the three agencies here of sharing data and information. Okay, Masa, over to you for some final thoughts of what on these comments and maybe something concrete that you're going to do moving forward.
Yes, maybe I'm repeating a bit myself. There are a project that is aimed to help the poor, help to narrow the disparities, etc. And there are projects which are aimed to do something else. And my consideration is to try to mainstream the equality dimension into this. And yes, there's a cost consideration of doing one step more, but what evaluators can do is to point out there is this kind of effect and this kind of causality that affects the power relationship or economic relationship that influences the disparities. For instance, recently we had this project evaluated in one of the African countries, very low productivity agriculture. Our agency bringing some new methodologies to increase the production. And then our evaluators went there. There's an increase in the production of that crop, but then we found the child labor increasing as well, because now they can earn money, so they brought in children to help out on the farm. Right? I'm not talking about cocoa, so please excuse me, but it happened. So we can point out the implication of our actions to not only the project objectives, but on the equality dimensions and different welfare, well-being dimensions. And this is one of the things we are trying to do. And also dissecting this equality dimension. I said there's an inequality, income equality, absolute inequality, or relative inequality, right? We are talking about power, or we are talking about income, or we are talking what? So we need to continue the conversation until we have a better understanding of what we should look at. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Oscar, what is your final word and concrete action moving forward?
Yes, in concrete terms, I think this reflection has been so important that we have shared this reflection with our IFAD management colleagues, because it's not exclusively an agenda item for evaluation. It is for the organization as a whole, because we are all committed to rural poverty reduction. And we have seen that high levels of inequality may hinder those effects in many countries. Therefore, very concretely, the way in which we may address this issue by the combination of the self-evaluation system and the independent evaluation system through a revised harmonization agreement about our practice, in our view, is a concrete step forward. And even going one step ahead of that, and more concretely with the team at the IOE, I think we need to make an effort to use better local level data. We have done that in some of our country program evaluations, and when we have access, even at secondary level of secondary data, disaggregate data at the local level, the quality of our analysis has improved significantly. We cannot do that in every country because that's not necessarily available in every country, but wherever it is, it will enlighten our analytical framework by really trying to understand better the differentiated needs of our target population.
Thank you so much. I think this is a really great session in terms of bringing everything together and really reflecting on all the things we've heard here. So thank you very much to our panelists. And thank you to all of you for participating. In fact, that was not Oscar's last word, because I'd now like to invite Oscar to give his very last word in his concluding remarks. Thank you.